the 12 solutions that we come up with, they will in total cost about, I'm giving you a rough estimate here because there's different ways to measure. It'll need about $35 billion a year in funding, and that funding could come from rich people like Elon Musk and Bill Gates. It could come from our development agencies, USAID or GIZ or whatever. We're spending $175 billion in development aid every year, so surely we could afford $35 billion. This is, as you mentioned, a drop in the bucket. It really is a rounding error. If we spent that amount of money over this decade, we would every year save 4.2 million lives. This is 8% of everyone who dies in the world. We could avoid 8% of all death in this world. Of course, we won't do that indefinitely because people have to die, but we would postpone that. That would be an incredible boon for a lot of people and a lot of societies. And at the same time, we would generate economic benefits worth $1.1 trillion. Just to give you a sense of proportion of what that means that we could almost make sure that every person in the poorer part of the world, so the 4.1 billion people that we talked about before, could get about $1 every day, almost $1 every day, each person. So these projects that cost virtually nothing could save 8% of everyone who dies and get almost all people in the poor half of the world $1 a day.
Okay, so I want to investigate something a little bit darker before we start our discussion about the projects per se. So one of the things that I see emerging on the chaotic and confused 169 goals front is an ethos that is also not precisely explicit, but that sort of lurks beneath the surface. And there are claims that go along with it. It might be that people who are listening think, well, this is all obvious. Obviously, we should spend money in the most efficient way. We should spend the least amount of money we have to spend. We should do it so that it does the most good. But we should also understand that there are real resistances to this approach. And so one of the resistances that's implicit and sometimes explicit is the notion that, well, first of all, we're playing a zero-sum game in the world, so if some people are rich, other people have to be poor. There's not enough for everybody. And then, which I don't believe to be true at all, and economists generally don't buy as an argument. And then the next argument would be, well, let's say we could make poor people richer, but that's not sustainable because to support everybody in the world at the Western standard of living would take 5 Earths. I've heard that figure bandied about, and there are probably there are way too many people on the planet. In any case, there should only be 500 million or 1 billion or maybe 2 billion if they lived, in poverty. And so there's this notion that the planet is truly finite in some fundamental sense. There's definitely not enough for everyone, and there's no way that we can elevate the living standards of the poor because all that would mean is that we're going to use up all the available resources faster. And so what do you think about?
So first of all, on the zero-sum game, remember 200 years ago, we have good data for the last 200 years. 200 years ago, almost every one of us were poor. We're extremely poor. So we lived at less than what used to be called $1 a day. So we were
That was 95% of people.
It was 95% of all people. Yeah. This is a terrible world. There's a few people who were, kings and dukes and those kinds of people. And then the rest of us were living in absolute poverty. We've pretty much eradicated most of that. Now it's only 10% that live at less than $1 a day, or what's really $2.15 now. But so fundamentally, we can absolutely have a world that's much better, that's much richer, and one that's obviously much better for these people. Now, people are worried about, well, can we sustainably live on this planet? But what you have to remember is this is not a question of whether we have the resources to it. Absolutely, we have the resources. When you hear this 5 Earths, that is a very, very bad comparison. I get why they made it, but it basically assumes that because of climate change, is almost entirely about climate change. Because of climate change, which is a real problem, because we emit CO2, you have to plant forest to soak up that extra amount of CO2. And if we all lived like Americans, then you would need 5 Earths. What they're really saying is you'd need 5 Earths of forest to plant. But that's the most inefficient way to get rid of CO2, much smarter way would be to put up, I don't know, wind turbines and solar panels. You could also put up nuclear power plants.
Well,
and
yes,
you could
we could do that.
We could have very, very little footprint. So actually, when you do the math, it turns out that this is just hokum. Yes, there is a problem. So we will do well within one Earth, even if we were much richer, all of us, and even if there were more people, so about 10 billion people. Yes, there is problems with having 10 billion people, but having 10 billion rich people also means we can deal with most of these problems.
Well,
so the
rich,
real problem
we should also point out,
if you're poor, that's the real pollution problem.
Right,
if you're poor, you pollute a lot. You both, you cut down your forest to keep, to slash burn, so you can grow some food for your kids. You'll have terrible indoor air pollution. You'll typically have very inefficient production. You will have all kinds of bad things. So what we really need, not just morally, to get people out of poverty and to get them to a good life, but also actually that's the only way we can get people to be so involved that they will want and they can afford to care about the environment.
Right. Well, we should also. We also have to watch very carefully the terminology we use, because when we start talking about making people rich, we need to really explain what that means. When we go back 200 years and everybody's scrabbling around in the dirt, what that really means is that people's next meal is uncertain, and so is the sustainability of their shelter, and the opportunities for them and their kids are extraordinarily limited. So when we're talking about wealth, we're not talking about cocaine and hookers in Vegas wealth. We're talking.
I was not talking about that, at least. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, people. The thing is, it brings up this specter of the 1920s spats-wearing capitalist who's like a complete libertine on his time off, and it's hyper-consumption wealth. But that's not what we're talking about at the low end of the world. We're talking about providing people with enough material security so that they can adopt a longer-term view, so that they can start to pay attention to what sort of planet their children and grandchildren might inhabit, and so that there's both reliable provision of food and shelter, basic health care, hygienic availability, and opportunity for their children. And so it's not exactly wealth we're after here, it's getting people away from zero.
Absolutely. So, but also, the people who are watching this, but also everyone who's really worried about that we're going to become these libertines from the 1920s, do they live like that? No, they don't. They live nice lives where they actually have heating in the winter and they have cooling in the summer. They have enough food. They don't have to worry about stuff. Their kids go to school. They have a nice life and they can go places and experience the world. Everyone obviously would like to have that same kind of life. And so this is not about absurd consumption or anything, but this is about actually being able to have a good life.
Well, it's also, as you pointed out, it's also one of the things that struck me when I was doing my original research on this front 15 years ago was the overwhelming evidence, and Marian Tupy's group has humanprogress.org has done a nice job of delineating that there's actually a positive relationship between population growth above a certain level of standard of living, let's say, and more abundance. And what I've come to understand in the intervening time, and this is something that's very much worth taking apart too, is that we have this notion of natural resource, and that's always struck me as specious, because natural means it's sort of there at hand. The only real natural resource I can think of is air, because all you have to do is breathe and it's there, but you still have to breathe, right? So there's still some effort involved in, but when you start talking about even the next stage, which would be water, it's like, well, is water a natural resource? Well, water is. Fresh water is a technological miracle, fundamentally. It takes a lot of industrial infrastructure and innovation to get fresh water to people. And of course, oil, petroleum, is barely a natural resource at all. I mean, we had petroleum forever. No one figured out what the hell to do with it until, about 1860, something like that. And so now it's a natural resource, but that's only because smart people figured out how to use it. And so there's always this dynamic interplay between human ingenuity and governance structures and plenty. And one of the things I've really come to understand is that abundance depends on the integrity of the individual, the moral integrity of the individual, and the validity of the governance structures far more than it does on natural resources. There's a zero-sum presumption in the natural resource discourse.
Yeah, that's just absolutely wrong. I mean, back in the early 1900s, for instance, iron is a big thing. We used to have just iron if it fell down as a meteorite.
Right.
Now pretty much everything we know is built with iron and steel. And back in 1900, Carnegie, the rich guy, worried immensely about the fact, because it's also important for military use, he worried that we were using up all the good iron and that there would be nothing left over for future generations. And what were they going to do? How were they going to defend themselves? All that kind of stuff. But what he failed to remember is that when, sure, we use up the easily accessible and high quality iron ore, so we have to dig deeper and we have to use worse iron ore. But we also have a lot more technology that makes it a lot easier to dig and utilize poor iron ore and get it out cheaper. That's what innovation means. So actually what's happened is that while we have used up the easily accessible iron ore, we have access to much, much more, much cheaper, much more effectively, and for all of humankind. Yeah. And this is true for pretty much all resources.
Yeah. Well, there was the famous bet between Paul Ehrlich and Julian Simon. Yeah. Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb, for everyone who's listening. He's still beating the same damn drum. Ehrlich and the Club of Rome types back in the 60s prognosticated that by the year 2000 there'd be mass starvation, and not only that the price of commodities would spike dramatically as inevitable scarcity kick in. So Ehrlich and the biological types who think his way think in Malthusian terms, and Malthus was an English thinker. He was a pastor, if I remember correctly, who posited that all things being equal, natural populations would expand to the point where they started to overconsume the available local resources and then collapse. So that's like the yeast in a petri dish model of humanity. And there's a couple of problems with that, is that it rarely works that way in the natural world because of checks and balances that emerge in ecosystems. But even more importantly, the idea that we are best modeled as yeast in a zero-sum petri dish is, let's call it, a bit presumptuous, if that. And Alfred North Whitehead, great thinker, pointed out that the reason that human beings think is so that we can let our ideas die instead of us. And so what that means is that what human beings have done is replace biological death. You die when you do the same old stupid thing too many times. So you have to either die and then new organisms emerge that do something different, or you have to shift the way you do things, which is kind of a virtual death. And that's what thought and discourse allows, is we can stop doing stupid things and we can start doing more efficient things. And there doesn't seem to be any real upper limit to that. No. And I think the evidence for that is, well, first of all, Ehrlich had that famous bet with Julian Simon, Simon, who was an economist, who said, all right, you can pick the basket of commodities, and I'll bet you, this was in the 60s, that by the year 2000, you can pick the arbitrary date, that those commodities will be less expensive, not more. No. And that there won't be instances of mass starvation, except unless they're politically produced. And of course, Simon famously collected in the year 2000, because what happened, even though Ehrlich picked the basket of commodities, was that the average price of the commodities had gone down so substantially that Ehrlich had to admit that he lost the bet.